Hello everyone and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast, and today I'm joined by writer Ross Sayers. Hello Ross.
Hi Alistair, thanks very much for having me on, it's much appreciated.
A pleasure, and we're here to talk mainly about your new novel, or your latest novel, Daisy on the Outer Line, which is out now with Cranachan Publishing.
Yep, came out in November, which this at one time feels like it just happened, but on the other hand it feels like years ago.
Yeah, the idea that time is relative has never felt more true, I think, than it does at the moment.
Absolutely.
We'll also talk about your other books because I've enjoyed all of your novels. But let's start with Daisy on the Outer Line. And how would you describe it before I start to talk about it?
So it's a young adult novel told in Scots from the point of view of a 19-year-old girl named Daisy. She's going through a bit of a tough time of it. Her stepdad's just passed away and she wasn't really on good terms with him anyway. And it sort of brought up a lot of other emotions in her, and she's not really being the best friend, she's not really being the best anything at the minute, and it sort of comes to a head at her Christmas night out at her work, and then she stumbles down drunk to the Glasgow subway and ends up going back 16 days in time, and I don't know how far to go with it, and then she has to basically work out how she's going to get back to normality, whatever that is.
I think that's a great place to leave it for now because we don't want to have any spoilers, but there's a lot in there already. Because as you say, the central character or the narrator of Daisy is, she's pretty extreme to begin with, understandably so. She's going through a lot of changes in her life. But was it difficult to write someone who, to begin with at least, isn't very pleasant?
Yes, no, it wasn't so hard to write her. It was, but I was aware while I was writing it that I thought, God, this isn't good. Like, people tend to want likable characters in their novels, and I'm like, I know I'm instantly taking off like half a star off a lot of people's reviews because they don't like Daisy. And I remember when I first showed it to the publisher, I said Daisy's not very likable. But then when they came back and said, yeah, we hate her, yeah, she's really unlikable, I was like, oh well. I felt really defensive for her. I was like, well, she's not that bad. So I think I think when I redrafted it, I tried to make her a little more likable every time I redrafted it. But yeah, she's not very likable. But it didn't really bother me because I knew where she was heading. But I guess, yeah, if you just picked up the book, read the first 5 chapters, and then decided she was never going to get any better, then I could see your point. Not that I want anyone to do that, but
no, but I think that's really interesting because you do stay with her even in those beginning the chapters. There's something about her that you do empathize. You might not forgive some of the actions, but you can kind of explain why she's perhaps acting in this way. And I think most people, if they're honest, have had times in their life where they look back and their behavior has been less than ideal, I would think. Maybe that's just me. But
no, same here. Plus she's 19, so yeah. That's a wee bit of an excuse, but no, I think we've all been there. Yeah, looking back and regretting things, and so I think maybe hopefully people will see a little bit of themselves in Daisy. Maybe not too much, but they'll probably maybe recognise a little bit of that sort of regret over your actions.
It also reminded me of, and I cannot at the moment remember who said it, but there was someone writing about Scottish literature and how it maybe differed to wider English literature, and saying that almost in English literature, the kind of extreme characters or the damaged characters are often to the sidelines. They're maybe the friends that need saved by by the main character and all those kind of things. But in Scotland, they tend to be the folk we write about, and that's what it reminded me of a bit. That here's someone who begins to. Well, she's literally got to go through a journey, to use that term. I think we can use it in this case, definitely. And I think you do stick with her. I mean, I don't think people would react to the book as they have if you didn't kind of stick with her. I was reading just before we met up on your website that the idea of this, the Conjern, started with a picture you took in an empty subway station saying, write a horror story about Glasgow Underground. Is that right?
Yes, I used to. So when I lived in Glasgow, I used to get the subway a lot, and generally Cowcaddon station was the station that I got off and on at the most because it was where my work was.
Mhm.
It's also just a handy station when you're in. If you say, I think that night I was actually at a book launch. I couldn't tell you who it was for, but it was a book launch at Waterstone, Sauchiehall Street.
Yeah.
So obviously getting home from there, Cowcaddon's in the closest station. And I don't know, it's probably not unique just to Cowcaddon's, but as the one that I visited the most, there's something a bit spooky about it, especially at night. I think it's the fact that it's one of those stations with just the one platform,
Yeah.
like no divider either side. And there's something about it, and obviously it's very quiet. Like for being in just off the centre of town, it's pretty much dead a lot of the time. And I did think, what like I really wanted to use it in a story, and I'm not really a horror writer per se, and horror's not really my bag. So, but I do like time travel, so that's where it stemmed from.
Yeah, I mean, you could say this is a bit of a horror story in that what Daisy has to go through is, pretty frightening at times. But as you say, there's the time traveling strand to it. And were you daunted by writing a time traveling novel? The why I ask that is I have found in the past that people who have either made time traveling films or time traveling novels, there's a lot of people willing to try and point the bits where it doesn't work. Okay, that couldn't happen because that person would, but do you know what I mean?
Yes, I sort of cheated in that it's not like a huge time travel story, and it doesn't travel over years and years and years and that kind of thing. I didn't need to like plot out, oh, can this character meet their own grandchild and all this kind of thing. I just had to plot out these 60 days. So on that hand, I did sort of cheat and just take the easy way out. But I still have there are still bits that I do find myself thinking, oh, like now no, I don't think anyone's really read it that many times that they've pointed out anything, but I have noticed things that I would potentially go back and just explain if I could try and explain. But there are bits, there is one or two bits where I'm like, oh yeah, that doesn't, don't know if that would really make sense if she could be there and she could be there, but no one's pulled me up on it yet. But I would imagine, if it somehow became a bestseller overnight, then I think I would be happy enough to take a few criticisms about it.
The sci-fi forums would start to kind of fill up.
I don't think I've reached them just yet.
But actually, it's a very clever idea, because when I kind of read the synopsis for the novel, that there was time traveling involved, and it was using the underground and knowing the underground is, hundreds of years old, not hundreds, but over 100 years old, that it would be back to period and something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, it kind of wrong foots you a little bit because it's such a short period of time. Was that always the intention?
It was. I think part of it is just obviously that would have probably included a lot of research, which is not is something I sort of try to avoid with making all my work, contemporary. That just basically means that I don't really enjoy the whole research part of it. But also, I think it's also stemmed from my favorite kind of time travel stories are ones that don't go back too far. I like people having access to technology, and I like those sort of contained stories where the character can meet themselves and you see the same thing from a couple of different points of view. So it was my main aim that I could I wanted to have the audience or the readers experience a certain amount of time, and then to see that time repeated again near the end of the novel, which I then had to work out how to do in sort of a short period of time, because essentially when you've got a time travel story, everything before the time travel is sort of just the stuff before the time travel. Like when people pick up the book until Daisy goes back in time, I think everyone's just waiting for Daisy to go back in time. So no one really enjoys that first bit because they're all waiting to get to the next bit. So that's why you have to sort of balance that, where you have to put in enough stuff at the start that can then pay off later, but also try and get to the time travel as soon as possible.
Yeah, And the two films I was thinking about were Back to the Future was one, because you have that in your own lifetime. I don't know if it is a time traveling film or not, but It's a Wonderful Life came to mind because there are lessons to be learned. What kind of influences did you have when writing it?
Well, it's funny you mention those two, because Back to the Future and It's a Wonderful Life are pretty much my two favourite films of all time. So, and but obviously I'm very aware that like I was sort of, when you're writing time travel at this point, it's very hard to be completely original, and you're lifting from different bits, so from different other books and films. So I do name check. I believe I name check both Back to the Future and It's a Wonderful Life in the book, which is a lot. I think it is a wee bit easier to do when you've got a character who's kind of pop culture savvy, and she can just drop them in, and it makes it look like I'm not. Like, hopefully, it makes it seem like I'm not trying to like just drop them in, and you can be like, oh well, it's Daisy that's saying that it's a bit like Back to the Future. Like, it's funnier when she says, oh, it's a bit like Back to the Future, this or whatever. So yeah, it's definitely, they were definitely both on my mind, because I wanted to get across that sort of excitement of Back to the Future with the redemption of It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
And I guess I think everyone who's coming up with a time travel story has to choose the rules that they're going to set for their time travel. I think every time travel story tends to be a little bit different in how they deal with it. You know, can't like, if your character goes back in time to a previous time, can those characters coexist? And like in Back to the Future, when Marty goes back, his actions can then erase the future.
Yeah.
Whereas in some other stories, if you go back in time and like everything has already happened, so anything that you do in the past will have like has already happened, and that's why it happened in the future. Which is sort of the rule that's sort of the side of it that I went for, and that when Daisy goes back in time, some of the things that she does then impact the future, but they've already happened in the first part of the book. If that makes any sense.
It does. I was just wondering if, well, one, that kind of shows how you have to get into the mindset of time traveling to kind of work out, you know, how you're going to approach it. But also, were there other influences that you brought as well, apart from those two films?
I think I read, not in terms of time travel, but I read Buddha Da by Anne Donovan. It's the first time I'd read it. Obviously, I'm really slow in catching up with a lot of these things, but I read that, and it sort of gave me that excitement to write in Scots again. Because I don't know, because I find sometimes when you read Scots books, like, I can say this, even as a Scots writer, I do understand that Scots does put some people off. And it's just about, I try and make mine as sort of easy to read as possible. So I try and, you know, I know it can be tricky trying to, for reading Scots where you're not that acclimatized to reading Scots. So I try and bridge that gap between English and Scots.
Because one I was thinking of, I don't know if you've read Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere.
No, I haven't.
Well, the reason that it reminds me of that is, one, a lot of it takes part under a different London, which is all underground. So you've got that kind of thing. But there's also this idea that people get lost and are no longer recognized and become almost ghosts, even though they aren't, you know, as yet. You know, they just become, I think what Neil Gaiman is trying to do is say that it's easy for people to be just ignored. And that thing, and I think there's a strand of that as well going on in the Daisy on the Outer Line. But you said there about the language used and the use of Scots, and I always think with any book, whether it's Trainspotting or whether it's Buddha Da, which is a terrific novel where three very distinct voices are heard because it's split up into three characters and absolutely stand on their own, but are still, you know, really read. The thing is, does it bring you up short, or do you read it through and quite quickly get into it? And I think that's what you do with your book, not just Daisy on the Outer Line, but also Sonny and Me as well. So
Thank you.
Well, let's go back to your first novel, which is Mary's the Name, which I happen to have a copy of here. Now, that was written. When did you write that? Gosh, I don't know. How long ago was that?
So I wrote it. Well, so it was written sort of between 2015 2016. It came out. In fact, it came out yesterday. Was the 4-year anniversary of the launch. So 4 years ago, it was released.
And it was your debut novel, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So how long had you been working on it? Because, you know, a lot of people talk about, well, I worked on this for a long time and then it came together and I got it published. Or did it come together pretty quickly?
Yeah, it actually was fairly quick. I have a really boring backstory as an author. A lot of authors are like, oh, I had this crazy job and then this crazy job, and then I had all these life experiences, and then that helped me to become an author. Whereas I'm like this sort of really boring cookie cutter route to publishing, in that I did my masters in creative writing at Stirling Uni, and that's when I wrote Mary's the Name. That's when I wrote sort of the first draft of it. I graduated. That would have been end of 2015. Submitted the book around a few places, and sort of April time I signed the deal with the publisher, and then by the next February it came out. So essentially, like I totally understand, and I feel so lucky that I've been, like luck plays a part as much as talent, I think, and I've definitely shaded it with the luck in that not many people write a book and then write their first book and then get it published. Most writers will have several books, several attempts. So yeah, I was extremely lucky that I wrote it, and then about a year and a half later, it was on the shelves.
And as you said, you write in what's called the YA, the young adult category. Was that something you wanted to do from the beginning?
It wasn't really something I thought about. It was just I sort of just kind of stumbled into it, because there's not like a huge. I wouldn't say there's a huge Scottish YA scene. Obviously there are plenty doing it, but I think when most people think of young adult, their mind instantly jumps to something like Twilight or The Hunger Games. Certainly, mostly American writers. And it was really just when I was writing Sonny and Me that it sort of came to me that what I tend to write tends to fit into young adult. So the younger characters and the themes and the fact that young adult tends to have a lot of plot and a lot of character, a lot of dialogue in it, which is something I just tend to write anyway. I really enjoy writing dialogue. Like I would hope that in most of my books, there's more pages of dialogue than there are full pages of descriptions of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Not as good at describing, but I like to think I've got an ear for dialogue. And yeah, I just sort of stumbled into it, and especially in Scots, there's not really much YA in Scots, so I guess I like to think I identified like a tiny, very 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 small niche, and hopefully I've sort of taken a claim for Scots YA, and hopefully I'll inspire others to.
Well, absolutely. And your publisher, Cranachan, they kind of specialise, don't they, in YA books, which is fantastic. They do incredible work, I think. So did that feel like your natural home once they published Mary's the Name?
Yes. Again, maybe it was just when you're a first-time writer, you do feel, I think, a certain sense of gratitude to the publisher for taking a huge chance on you, because obviously I'm still fairly unknown at the minute, but even back 4 years ago, I was complete unknown. And they take chances on debut children's writers all the time, which is incredible. And it's not something that a lot of publishers do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we're extremely lucky to have them. And again, they've only been around, I think maybe only about 6 months to a year longer than me, if you know what I mean. So like they had started up, and then a year later they published me. So again, got very lucky with the timing there. And also the fact that, I mean, not that this is the main thing, but when I was writing Sonny and Me, I did think, oh, but like I'm writing in Scots. That's just how I feel. The characters would speak. I was also filling it up with quite a lot of strong language, and it hadn't really occurred to me like, is this young adult? I think if I went to pretty much any other publisher with a young adult book in Scots with a decent amount of swearing in it, I would have just been sort of laughed at the offices. Whereas they were like, yeah, that's absolutely fine. And even since then, I do get people saying to me like, "Oh, like I thought you couldn't swear too much in young adult or whatever." And I don't know, it's just Cranachan don't have a problem with it, which is great because that's what kids.
Absolutely.
It sounds really basic, but the kids want to read that because they don't want to feel like they're being spoken down to. And if you don't speak to them at their level, they're just going to go out and find other books that do. Because I think a young adult, especially like kids at that age, they always want to read what they're not supposed to read.
Yeah.
Like when I was a kid, I didn't want to read. Like if someone said, "Oh, this book is for your age level," I'd be like, "Right, can I read the book that's up from that age level?" You know, if I was 15, I wouldn't want to just watch 15 certificate films.
Mhm.
All I want to do is watch 18. So it's about your job as sort of a young adult writer is to keep their attention, which is hard enough to get in the first place.
Sure.
Because there's so much else out there. So it's all about making sure that they see themselves reflected and that they see that they're not being spoken down to, and that this stuff is better, is essentially better than anything else they could find that would be more adult or whatever, and that it's not being like this. Like schools aren't choosing these books because to keep them at a level, like they're sort of talking up to them. If anything, I like to think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned Sonny and Me there, which I also have here, which it does exactly that. You know, it's set. It's a bit. I think I described it as kind of being in the in-betweener years. So you're in your teenage years, and absolutely captures that time in someone's life perfectly. Again, going back to films, I could have, reminded me of John Hughes movies, or even Gregory's Girl, or a fantastic film called Brick that Rian Johnson did, set at that time. How did you approach writing Sonny and Me?
Also, it's just before I answer that, Arthur, it's funny you mention Gregory's Girl because I hadn't seen Gregory's Girl prior to writing the book, and my publisher said, "Oh, you should." It's a bit like Gregory's Girl, so obviously I went and watched it. It was obviously brilliant. It's a classic. But it's funny when we were sort of trying to pitch Sonny and Me to certain places, certain book festivals or whatever. We're trying to think of comparisons, and all we really had was, I think we settled on. I think at some point it was between like, oh, it's like Gregory's Girl meets Still Game, or Gregory's Girl meets In-Betweeners,
Yeah.
or something like that. And it just, I like to think it sort of showed that there is a sort of a lack of stories about Scottish teenagers, especially currently, because, I mean, Gregory's Girl came out in 70
Oh, 80,
something.
early 80s.
Or was it? Was it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a long time ago now. And the only other thing we have to compare it to is like Still Game, which is obviously nothing like, the characters aren't exactly teenagers. So it shows you that we don't really have something like that. Like I really think that Scotland is missing out on like a teenage show, like it's set in school, because obviously In-Betweeners for England, and then you've got Dairy Girls. I just think there's an untapped market there, for someone to come into, if any TV producers are watching.
I think that's probably true. I mean, you think about the richness of the language, which you capture, I have to say, particularly in Sonny and Me, of how people speak to each other at that time and the way they treat each other. It would be a rich vein for those kind of shows. Yeah, maybe you're the person to write it.
Well, if someone wants to pay me to do it, obviously I'll do
Of
it.
course.
But you were saying about approaching writing it. It's tricky. I don't really remember how the idea came. It was, I guess I just thought I wanted to write something set in a school, something like with the characters like people in my high school.
Yeah.
And I knew I wanted a mystery in it. I knew I wanted something like a strong hook about like a murder or something. And yeah, because it's based essentially in my high school. I just changed the name a little bit, because I just didn't feel like there was anything out there that kids really, I think particularly Scottish kids really can really see themselves in. Although I find that even though I realise that for an author I'm relatively young, but even then it's now been it's coming up in like 11 years since I left high school. So obviously I'm even though it's a new book and it's set currently, I realised that I can never completely get that right, because in 10 years is like an ice age in high school terms. Like, technology's completely changed, everything's totally changed. So you can really only do your best sort of assumption of what high school is, because I try not to focus too much on the technology, even though they do have phones and that does come into that is important in the plot. Sure. I did try and focus more on just the things that hopefully never change, like who you fancy and the bullying and just the stuff that really happens, and that, unfortunately,
the friendship.
It's generally the bad stuff that doesn't change.
Yeah, but the thing that sticks out for me is the friendship made, and often the friendships made at that time are the ones that really endure and mean the most. And a lot of the things that happen at that time are the things that mean the most. Recently, there was a piece in a newspaper about just that, how the things that you fall in love with in your teen years are often tattooed with you, they stay with you for the rest of your life. And I think that gets that completely, how, and it's in Daisy as well, as how kind of painful, I mean, in a kind of sensitive way that can be to all your senses that time. I think it captures it well. Now, you also mentioned about concentrating on dialogue rather than description. And I would say that all three of your novels, you capture the character, and the characters stand alone, and you get their voice, which must be difficult because Mary's 8, I think. And then, as we said, the kind of in between her years of the mid-teen years with them, and then, as you said, Daisy's 19. So, how does the character and the way that they speak come to you naturally? Is, I guess, what I'm saying.
I think a lot of it is just writing in the voice, and the longer you write in a particular voice, the more you get to know the voice. I find that I'll write a draft, and then when I'm redrafting, there's a lot of, like, by the end of a draft, I'll generally have the voice down, but there'll be stuff at the start, and I'll read it and I'll think, the character would never say that, or they would never say it in that way. I don't know what I was thinking. I obviously didn't have the character down in the first few chapters, and maybe I didn't get them until then. And then even then, sometimes when you'll have redrafted it loads of times, and there'll still be things that you'll go, oh, actually the character wouldn't do that. So it's just about learning the character, because it's very hard to come up with like a fully fledged character in your mind. And I guess every author will have their own way of doing it. They might, I know some authors, I can't remember the woman's name, the woman who wrote Queenie.
Oh yes, I can't remember.
She was on a podcast I was listening to, and she says that she plans out all her characters' star signs, right, and their horoscopes, and bases their personality around that, which is obviously genius. I really should start doing that. Whereas I usually I'm probably just, I don't know if it's just laziness or just I'm just too excited to start writing. I'll just start writing, and I'll just start writing the character and sort of working them out on the way, because obviously, as an author, you have the benefit of going back and redrafting it 100 times if you want, which is something you obviously can't do like in like a TV show. Once you start that show, you can't go back and change the first few episodes. As much as I'm sure many TV shows would like to do. So you do have that advantage. And so I guess I'll have the idea for the character, and I'll just write my way into them, and then redrafting helps me shape them.
And I mean, that kind of goes back to Daisy, because you said when you had got the feedback that she really wasn't unlikable, and you started to get a bit defensive about that. And is that because, in a way, you've been with her, but also the backstory? It's a bit like an actor who decides to build the backstory behind their character, and only 10% is ever maybe used. Is that a similar type of thing?
Yes, I think so. Again, I don't plot out. I maybe don't plot out everyone's birthdays and their horoscopes and stuff, but I definitely every author will be the same. However long a book takes you to read, the author will have spent 100 times that many hours with those characters. Particularly, like, you know, if you read a chapter and it's like a scene, you know, it takes you a few minutes to read that. Whereas that, when the author was writing that scene, it was hours and hours and hours and hours and hours spent redrafting that, and the author's lived in that scene, and the author's lived every moment of that. And it feels like, yeah, you do get to know your characters so well, and you've spent so much time with them, and then, you know, you read it back and you go, and you remember, as an author, you remember all the time you spent crafting that scene and all the little details that maybe you didn't put it down on the page, if like there or were there in previous drafts. And it's a strange thing, because obviously how your character is perceived is totally out of your hands once it goes
Yeah.
to the printers. You don't get to be sitting next to the reader when they go, oh, I don't know about that, but you can't be sitting next to them and go, oh no, that makes sense. I just didn't say, but 3 weeks before that she actually did this, and that kind of thing. So yeah, it can be a bit daunting to let your characters go like that. But and yeah, I think any author is going to be defensive, even about their. Well, it depends how bad their baddies are, but even the baddies and the people that you're not meant to like, I think you're defensive about them as well.
I mean, I have spoken to a few crime writers who say that way, you know, some of their characters, even the villains, will do some despicable things, but they say, but you don't understand, I've had a hard life, all that kind of stuff. It's just struck me that we've gone from Mary being about 8 and then mid-teens and now 19. So if to follow that path, is the next book going to be, I mean, you're going to run out of being called young adult quite soon.
Well, see, this is the thing. It's young adult is essentially, it's meant to be like, obviously there's no set rules for it, but young adult tends to be characters who are between about 13 and 18.
Yeah.
Whereas I would think that I've kind of shown that you don't necessarily need to be specifically those ages, because obviously Mary's 8, Daisy's 19. The next YA book that I'm writing, the character is 18, and potentially going off to uni, which I think, again, is not something you see too much in young adult, because it tends to be focused on the high school years, and then it's like when they head off to high school, that's like the end.
Yeah.
You never see what happens after that. It's like they have their perfect moment at the end of high school where they learn who they are, and then that's the end. So hopefully I'm going to explore that a bit, and how you because you might find yourself in high school, but then you go to university or you go out to a job, and then your personality changes once again, because you really don't. I don't think you have. Certainly, I didn't have a grasp of who I was at the end of high school. I still don't, but it definitely. I just find it changes at every stage of life. So I think there's still plenty of stuff to be written about that.
Oh no, there certainly is. I certainly is. Just when I was going through the 3 there, I noted that things were getting older. And again, going back to the language, I think it's easy. It's interesting to reflect on the 3, because with Mary's the Name, you've got a young speaker, and again, you capture that young voice of someone who seems to be trying her best to speak as she believes she should speak. You know, there's that expectation. It reminded me of James Kelman's Kieran Smith Boy, where Kieran Smith is always trying to speak the correct way that he's been told at school and all of that stuff. And then by Sonny and Me, there is that kind of move to Scots, but there's also that thing about you speak differently in the classroom perhaps than you do in the playground, that kind of thing. And then by the time you get to Daisy, she's in the workplace, or at least, you know, and speaking how she likes. Do you think about it like as carefully as that, about how everyone is going to speak, or is it just, as you say, just spending time with them, the voice comes through?
Yeah, I'll think about that, because with Mary,
Yeah,
I had her speak in a sort of, you know, more properly than her grandpa speaks, because he's obviously been her main influence in her life, and he's very much of the thinking, or of the generation that he's in. It, I'm fairly sure I wrote this in the book, that he tells her, don't speak like me, don't pick up bad habits like me, because that's not going to serve you when you leave school, and that kind of thing, which is still an attitude that lingers to this day. About, you know, got to speak properly if you're going for an interview or anything like that, or in a professional setting. Sonny and Me, yeah, again, I didn't go into Sonny Me thinking this explicitly, this is definitely has to be in Scots. It was just, I'm writing about these characters and they're not going to speak in the Queen's English. And yeah, and I do enjoy the contrast you can get from that. You have the boys speaking one way, and then you have the teacher speaking another way, and then you see that the parents speak more like the kids and that kind of thing when they're not in the workplace and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And Daisy, again, it was the same thing. It was because she's seeing the counsellor at the start.
That's right. Yeah.
And the counsellor speaks in sort of your standard English. And I hope that gave like a nice contrast at the start. And then when she goes to her work, you don't actually see Daisy working, but you see her speaking to her friends at work who don't actually recognise her, and they're using their customer voice on her because they don't know that that's their pal. So they treat her like a customer and they put on their fancy voice. So yeah, it's definitely something that you think about because yeah, when you're writing in Scots, you give your main character, you assign characters, right? They're going to speak in Scots, they're going to speak in Scots, but then you then have to, you tend to assign other characters not to speak in Scots because it would probably be a bit unrealistic if every character was speaking Scots. So it's about getting that balance right, and yeah, there's a lot of fun to be had with characters who speak different levels of Scots, and so like at the start, Daisy is on a first date. She's on a Tinder date with a guy, and he doesn't know the word pervy, so he doesn't know where they're going.
Yeah.
And he has no idea. He just thinks it's dating, and he turns up and he's a bit confused. So there's fun to be had with it, I think.
Yeah, I think it's what you do so well. Go back to this idea of getting the characters' voices, is that everyone is an individual, and they're not just in what they do, but the way that they speak as well. So it's not you saying, well, I'm going to write this in Scots, and that's across the board using the same way that, because you wouldn't do that in any other way. You're thinking about how that individual speaks down to many, many factors, that in their life, their backgrounds, or, where they happen to be at that time or the situation they find themselves. And I think, I think you do that better than many writers.
Thank you.
So you said there about what you're going to be doing next. Can you see anything more about it, or you want to keep that close to your chest, which is fine if you are?
Well, I mean, I've just started out with it, but the next young adult book I've got the idea for, it's about, again, yeah, I really can't give too much away because I've really not written much of it. Because I've just not written that much of it, so it would be impossible. But it's going to be, I think, about young woman, 18, leaves. It's essentially like the start of the book that I've written. It's that moment where high school ends, and that's where the films tend to finish, and it doesn't set you up for what it's like to go to uni. So it's about this girl. She's like, right, well, I don't really know where there's no roadmap from here. So it's about her moving off to uni for the first time and making friends and joining societies and that kind of thing.
I'm just thinking the way it's been this year, that might seem like historical fiction by the time it gets put out, the idea that people go to uni. And
it's so tricky because last year, I think a lot of writers, maybe March, April time, were like, right, we'll just no mention it, or we'll just settle our book. Because I wrote a book last year, which is sort of in the ether at the minute, and I just set it in 2019 to save any headaches. Whereas now it's getting to a stage where it's like, well, it's very, because obviously no one really wants to read about coronavirus. Like if someone released a book about, I don't know, like something set during these times, everyone would go, we don't want to read about that right now. We want escapism. But it is getting to the point where, how do we not mention it? Like, obviously, I'm guessing the authors must have had this dilemma during like the world wars. Like, people didn't want to read about the wars, but how do you not mention it? So obviously, it's going to be a lot, like, everything's hopefully, touch wood, it's going to be a lot easier once anything gets back to close to normal. But it does feel like, as a writer, you're sort of stuck, or a contemporary writer, because if you set a book this year, it's either mention the coronavirus or just pretend it didn't happen at all, which would be very strange if you read a book that was set during 1942 and there was just no mention of the war and everyone was going along happily. you'd think, what's going on? This is like
Yeah.
an alternate existence. So
I,
is it tricky?
I was listening to a crime drama on Radio 4 the other day, and it was the first time I've heard references to could you use the hand gel and could you come in here with your masks on and stuff. And it was quite odd, but in the same way you thought, yeah, at least someone's kind of facing up to the here and now and as they're doing it.
Well,
Now,
I think this.
Mhm.
So I think the soaps are doing it.
Of course.
I caught a bit of Corey, and yeah, they've all got the masks on and social distancing and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's interesting. So some people are facing up to how they're doing things. Well, I hope it won't be too long before we can meet up at a book launch or something like that in the flesh. That would be nice.
Oh, it'd be lovely.
Ross, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Arthur. Honestly, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me, and yeah, thanks for this. Thanks for all your support about the books.
My pleasure. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers.